The heat in the town of Serenity was a physical weight pressing down from a sky the color of bleached bone. Dust, fine as flour, coated everything: the warped planks of the boardwalk, the sleeping dog in the shade of the assay office, the silent men whose eyes tracked every newcomer. Elias Vance felt the grit between his teeth. He was just passing through another drifter, trying to outrun the sun and the memories that burned hotter still. He needed supplies, a day's rest, nothing more. He was inside the Serenity Bank and Trust, counting out the last of his coins for a money order, when the leisurely afternoon shattered. Glass exploded inward from the front window. A woman screamed, a sound cut short. Elias hit the floor, his instincts buried, but not dead, taking over. Years of wearing a U.S. Marshal's star had carved those reflexes into his soul. Men in dusters, their faces hidden by grimy bandanas, stormed the bank. They moved with brutal efficiency, their pistols barking orders. On the floor now, the bank manager, a portly man with sweat beading on his bald head, raised his hands. "Take what you want. Just don't hurt anyone." The leader stepped forward, ignoring the manager. He was taller than the others, his movements possessing a languid, almost reptilian grace. Unlike his men, he wore no bandana. His face was sharp, intelligent, with eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. He carried himself not like a common thief, but like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of violence. He scanned the room, his gaze dismissing the terrified tellers, the cowering customers. Then his eyes locked onto Elias, a flicker of recognition. No, it was something else. A hunter's focus. The man's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile as he walked directly toward Elias, who lay still, feigning the same terror as everyone else. Elias's hand twitched instinctively, reaching for a Colt that was no longer there. He had traded his guns for a medicine bag months ago, a vow made over a fresh grave. Now that vow felt like a shroud. The leader stopped the toes of his polished boots, inches from Elias's face. Well, what have we here?" His voice was not the rough bark of a desperado. It was cultured, laced with a cold, almost serpentine wit. He knelt, his pistol remaining steady, aimed at the center of Elias's chest. "Just a dusty traveler, I see, a man of no consequence." He reached out, not for Elias's wallet, but for the thin, silver chain around his neck. With a flick of his wrist, he snapped it free. In his gloved hand lay a small, tarnished silver locket. A cold dread, sharper than any blade, pierced Elias's heart. "No." He breathed the word, a raw whisper. The leader's smile widened. He pressed the clasp and the locket sprang open. Inside, safe, behind a tiny pane of glass, was a miniature portrait of a woman with warm, laughing eyes and hair the color of spun gold. Lillian. She was beautiful. The man said, his voice a soft mockery. He snapped the locket shut, the click echoing in the sudden silence of the bank. A memory worth holding on to. Or perhaps, he added, his gray eyes boring into Elias's, a memory worth taking. He stood pocketing the locket. The violation was more profound, more absolute than any bullet. He had not just robbed a bank. He had plundered Elias's soul, stealing the last tangible piece of a life that was gone forever. "The money, gentlemen," the leader said to his men, his attention already moved on. As they stuffed canvas bags with cash, he walked to the door, pausing on the threshold. He looked back at Elias, still frozen on the floor. "Our paths will cross again, Marshal." He said the title, a deliberate twist of the knife. "I will make sure of it." Then he was gone. The thunder of hoofbeats faded into the oppressive heat, leaving behind shattered glass and a silence filled with Elias's roaring grief. He didn't care about the bank's money. He didn't care about the terrified townspeople. He only knew that a man named Silas Blackwood, he had heard one of the robbers use the name, had stolen his wife's memory. And Elias, the man who had vowed to heal, felt the cold, familiar itch of the trigger finger on his empty hand. The quest for redemption was over. The hunt for revenge had just begun. 2 weeks later, Elias rode into a town that looked like it had been forgotten by God and left to fester under the Arizona sun. The sign read, Redemption Creek. A name so soaked in irony, it was almost a prayer. The town was a collection of ramshackle buildings slouching against one another for support. The saloon's swinging doors groaned a weary welcome, and the blacksmith's hammer kept a steady, mournful rhythm against the anvil. Dust devils danced across the parched earth, and the air was so dry, it felt like breathing powdered glass. This was Silas Blackwood's domain. Elias had tracked him here, following a trail of whispers and fear left in the wake of a dozen brutal land grabs. Elias had renounced his past, trading his star for a healer's satchel. He called himself a doctor now, a title he'd earned through necessity, and study mending the bodies of men his former profession had taught him only how to break. He kept his head down, his voice low, offering his services for a meal or a few coins, gathering information in quiet murmurs. He learned that Redemption Creek was squeezed in the fist of a brutal lawman, Sheriff Wade Morrison, who served an unseen landowner, buying up every failing ranch and dry well for pennies on the dollar. A landowner whose name Elias discovered with a cold certainty was Silas Blackwood. His search for the locket had led him into the heart of his enemy's web. For now, he would play the part of the quiet healer, observing, waiting for Blackwood to reveal himself. He treated a prospector's fever, set a stable hand's broken arm, and listened. He learned of the town's fear of Morrison's cruelty, and of the local Apache tribe pushed to the brink of starvation by Blackwood's expanding territory, their sacred lands now fenced off with barbed wire. Elias felt a familiar sickness in his gut. It was the same story he'd seen 100 times, as a martial power preying on the weak, with the law serving as its bludgeon. His quiet existence was shattered on a Tuesday. Screams, sharp and piercing, cut through the midday heat. A crowd was gathering in the town square, their faces a twisted mask of grim satisfaction. Elias moved toward them, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. In the center of the square, a woman knelt in the dust, her wrists bound to a hitching post. Her simple blue dress was torn at the shoulders, revealing 2 weeping, bloody furrows across her back. Sheriff Morrison, a mountain of a man, whose belly strained against his vest like a sausage casing about to burst, stood over her, a bullwhip coiled in his hand. Morrison wasn't just enforcing the law, he was savoring it. Elias could see it in the chillingly calm way he adjusted his grip on the whip and the faint, satisfied smile playing on his lips as he watched his victim tremble. "You think you can coddle them savages without consequences, woman?" Morrison bellowed, his voice thick with malice. The woman, Rebecca Hayes, a widow Elias had spoken to briefly at the general store, lifted her chin. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes burned with a defiant fire. "That child was hurt and hungry," she said, her voice clear and steady despite her pain. Any decent human being would have done the same. A man in the crowd shouted, "Indian lover." The cry was taken up by others, a chorus of hatred that fed the sheriff's righteous fury. Elias saw it all with a marshal's clarity. The mob mentality, the lawman's sadism, the innocent woman paying the price for an act of simple compassion. He had learned she'd been caught giving food and tending a wound on a young Apache boy. In Redemption Creek, that was a crime punishable by public flogging. His vow of nonviolence screamed in his mind. He had promised Lillian on her deathbed that he would never take another life, that he would use his hands to heal, not to harm. But watching Morrison raise the whip for a third strike, Elias knew that some vows were luxuries a man could not afford. To stand by and do nothing was a different kind of violence, the violence of cowardice. He began to move. He didn't run. He walked, his steps measured and deliberate. The crowd parted before him, sensing a shift in the air, a quiet authority that emanated from the unassuming doctor. "That's enough, Sheriff." Elias said. His voice was quiet, yet it cut through the mob's jeers like a razor. Morrison turned his face flushing with anger at the interruption. "Who the hell are you to tell me my business, Sawbones?" He sneered, sizing up Elias's worn clothes and the leather medicine bag slung over his shoulder. "I'm the man telling you to stop." Elias replied, his gaze unwavering. He kept his hands open and visible, a deliberate sign of non-aggression. But his stance was that of a man who knew how to handle himself, a coiled spring of deadly potential. Morrison laughed, an ugly guttural sound. "Get out of my way, or you'll get a taste of this yourself." He drew back his arm, the whip whistling through the air. Elias moved faster than anyone thought possible. He didn't draw a gun. He didn't throw a punch. He stepped inside the arc of the whip, his hand shooting out to catch Morrison's wrist. His grip was like iron. For a moment that stretched into eternity. The two men were locked in a silent struggle. The hulking sheriff, fueled by rage and authority, against the quiet doctor, fueled by a grief so profound it had become its own source of strength. Elias applied pressure to a nerve in Morrison's wrist, a technique learned not in a bar fight, but from a Chinese railroad worker he'd once saved. The sheriff's fingers went numb, his grip faltering. The bullwhip fell to the dust. Morrison stared at his tingling hand, and then at Elias, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fury. The crowd was silent, stunned. The doctor, the quiet man who patched up their scrapes and ailments, had just disarmed the most feared man in town with nothing but his hands. "This ain't over," Morrison snarled, backing away, his hand instinctively going to the pistol on his hip. His deputy, a young nervous man named Ben Carter, moved to his side, his own gun drawn, but held uncertainly. Elias didn't flinch. He simply knelt beside Rebecca, pulling a small knife from his bag to cut her bonds. "It is for today," he said, his voice low and final. He had saved the woman, but in doing so he had stepped out of the shadows. He had challenged the law in Blackwood's town. He knew with a chilling certainty that he had just made himself the center of Silas Blackwood's attention. The hunt was no longer one-sided. The game had begun. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the mesas in hues of blood and gold. Elias guided his horse through the labyrinth of canyons, Rebecca riding behind him, her small frame slumped with exhaustion. Her back had been cleaned and bandaged with supplies from his satchel, but he knew the deeper wounds and the fear the humiliation would take longer to heal. "They'll come after us," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that sighed through the sagebrush. "I know," Elias said. "We need to find a place to rest, a place they won't look." He was leading them toward the Broken Tooth Mountains, a territory the townsfolk avoided. They called it Apache land, a place of ghosts and sudden death. But Elias knew that sometimes the most dangerous places were the safest. As twilight deepened, casting long skeletal shadows across the landscape, they were not alone. Figures materialized from the rocks, silent as the dusk itself. Apache warriors. They were surrounded. Their leader, an older man with a face like carved granite and eyes that held the wisdom of generations, stepped forward. His hair was streaked with gray, and he carried a simple bow, yet he radiated an authority more potent than any sheriff's badge. "You are the one they call healer," the man said, his English measured and precise. "The one who helped the boy." Elias dismounted slowly, keeping his hands in sight. "The boy was hurt. I did what anyone should have." The elder's gaze shifted to Rebecca, taking in her bandaged back with an unreadable expression. "Kindness is a rare medicine in these lands. My nephew Little Fox told us of your courage. He said a white woman with the spirit of a healer saved him." The pieces clicked into place. The boy Rebecca had helped was this man's nephew. Her act of compassion had forged an unlikely bond. "My name is Shadow Walker," the elder said. "You have shown honor to my family. We will offer you sanctuary. But your enemies are many, and they ride with the devil's own hunger. Shadow Walker led them to a hidden camp nestled in a box canyon, so cleverly concealed it was invisible until you were upon it. It was a place of quiet dignity. Women tended fires, children played under the watchful eyes of their mothers, and the air was filled with the scent of roasting meat and the soft cadence of the Apache language. They were a people holding on a small flame of resilience in a world determined to extinguish them. Over the next few days, Elias found an unexpected peace in the Apache camp. He worked alongside their medicine woman, a wise elder named Wise Crow, sharing his knowledge of sutures and antiseptics, while learning from her about the healing properties of desert plants. He saw how Shadow Walker led his people not through fear, but through wisdom and respect. He spoke of the earth not as something to be conquered, but as a mother to be honored. The white man builds fences to own the land. Shadow Walker told him one evening as they watched the stars ignite in the vast dark sky. But a man cannot own his own mother. He can only serve her or he will perish. Rebecca, under the care of Wise Crow, began to heal. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a quiet strength. She helped with the children, her gentle nature a balm in a community that had known too much hardship. She and Elias spoke little of the future, but a silent understanding grew between them. They were both adrift, both scarred by the world's cruelty, finding a fragile hope in this hidden place. But the world was not so easily kept at bay. A scout returned with news from Redemption Creek. Sheriff Morrison, publicly humiliated, was on a rampage. And he wasn't alone. Men had ridden into town, hard men with cold eyes and new rifles. They answered to one man, Silas Blackwood. "He has returned," the scout reported. "He asks for the doctor who interfered with the sheriff's justice." That evening, as Elias cleaned his meager supplies, a young Apache warrior approached him. He carried a small leather-wrapped parcel. "A rider from the town left this at the edge of our lands. He said it was for the healer." Elias's hands trembled as he unwrapped it. Inside was a single perfect white rose, its petals impossibly fresh in the desert heat. Attached to its stem with a black silk ribbon was a note. The handwriting was elegant, precise, a flower for a memory. She loved white roses, did she not, Marshal Vance? Come and claim what is yours. Or shall I find another neck for this lovely locket to adorn? Perhaps the fair Rebecca's. S.B. The blood drained from Elias's face. The rose. It was Lillian's favorite. On their first anniversary, he had filled their small home with them. How could Blackwood know that this was no random taunt? This was a scalpel sliding into an old wound with surgical precision. The mention of Rebecca was a clear threat, turning his own compassion into a weapon against him. He looked up at the impassive face of the canyon walls, and he knew his time of hiding was over. Blackwood wasn't just a land baron. He wasn't just a thief. He was a ghost from Elias's past, a past he thought he had buried. "What is it?" Rebecca asked, her voice soft with concern, as she saw the look on his face. Elias couldn't bring himself to show her the note. He simply looked at her, at the quiet strength she represented, and then at the mountains that held Blackwood and the stolen memory of his wife. "It's a reckoning," he said, his voice raw, "and it's long overdue." The next day, Elias rode out alone, leaving the sanctuary of the canyon behind. He had tried to dissuade Rebecca from following, but she had stood firm, her gaze as resolute as his own. "You are not the only one with a fight in them, Elias Vance," she had said, her hands busy packing a small bag with medical supplies. "I will not hide while you face him alone." Shadow Walker had offered the support of his warriors, but Elias refused. "This is my fight. It started long before I came to this town." The Apache elder had simply nodded, his eyes filled with a deep understanding. A man who walks the path of vengeance often finds it leads back to his own heart. Be careful it does not consume you. Before Elias left, Shadow Walker pressed a carved amulet into his hand. The spirit of the hawk flies with you. It sees all from above. Elias found Deputy Ben Carter on the outskirts of town, ostensibly checking fence lines. The young lawman was visibly shaken, his face pale and his hands unsteady. "You can't go back in there, Doc," Ben pleaded. "Morrison's gone crazy. And Blackwood. There's something about him that ain't right. He's got the whole town locked down." "I have to," Elias said simply. "Tell me about Blackwood. He's staying at the old Miller Ranch, the one he bought out last month." Ben said, lowering his voice. "He's got a dozen hired guns with him. They say he never raises his voice, just looks at a man, and it's like winter setting in your bones." Elias knew that winter. He'd seen it in Blackwood's eyes in the bank in Serenity. "Carter." Elias said, his voice firm. "You have a choice to make. You can keep wearing that badge for a man like Morrison, or you can stand for what's right." He didn't wait for an answer. He rode on, leaving the young deputy to wrestle with his conscience. The Miller Ranch was situated in a wide valley, a fortress of adobe and timber. Guards were posted on the ridges, their rifles glinting in the sun. Getting in would be suicide. Elias circled the property from a distance, studying it with a marshal's eye, noting the patterns of the patrols, the layout of the buildings. He needed a way to draw Blackwood out to face him on ground of his own choosing. He found his answer in the town's lifeblood, the aqueduct that carried water from the mountains to Redemption Creek, and all of Blackwood's newly acquired ranches. It was a feat of engineering and a critical vulnerability. Under the cover of darkness, with the help of a few of Shadow Walker's warriors who had followed him against his orders, Elias set a small, precisely placed charge of blasting powder he'd acquired from a sympathetic prospector. The explosion was not large, but it was effective. It cracked the main channel, diverting the precious water into the thirsty sand. By morning, the town's well was running dry. Panic began to set in. Blackwood's empire, built on controlling the land, was nothing without water. Elias knew Blackwood would have to come into town to address the crisis. He was setting the stage. He sent one of the Apache warriors with a message for Ben Carter, a simple plan that relied on the young deputy finding his courage. Then he waited. Blackwood arrived in town near midday, flanked by 4 of his gunmen. He didn't rage or bluster. He moved with that same unnerving calm, his gray eyes taking in the worried faces of the townspeople. Sheriff Morrison waddled beside him, shouting threats and blaming the Apache. Blackwood held up a hand, and the sheriff fell silent. "Patience, Sheriff." Blackwood said, his voice carrying easily in the tense quiet. "The water will be restored. First, we must deal with the pest who caused this inconvenience." His gaze swept the rooftops, the alleys, the silent windows. "Come out, Marshal Vance. Our business is not with these good people." Elias stepped out from the shadowed doorway of the blacksmith shop, his hands empty. He walked to the center of the main street, stopping by the town's dry fountain. Blackwood smiled a predator's smile. "There you are. I knew you couldn't resist a grand gesture. It was always your weakness." "You know me," Elias said, his voice level. "But I don't know you." "Oh, I think you do," Blackwood replied, taking a step closer. He began to hum a soft, simple tune, a lullaby. The melody struck Elias like a physical blow. It was the tune Lillian used to hum when she worked in her garden. A private song known only to the 2 of them. A cold dread snaked its way up his spine. "The name is Silas Blackwood," the man said, his voice dropping to a near whisper for Elias's ears only. "But perhaps you'd remember my brother better. Daniel Blackwood. A simple farmer, you recall. You shot him down in the street in El Paso. Called it justified. Said he drew on you first. The memory buried under years of guilt and grief came rushing back. El Paso, 5 years ago. A land dispute. Elias, the marshal, had been called to serve an eviction notice. Daniel Blackwood had been drunk angry, waving a pistol. Elias had tried to talk him down, but the man had raised his weapon. Elias had been faster. A single shot. Legally justified, the inquiry had ruled. But morally, Elias had lived with the man's terrified eyes ever since. It was one of the last arrests he made before turning in his star. He was my younger brother. Silas said, his voice vibrating with a hatred so cold it was absolute. When you killed him, you didn't just take his life. You killed my mother, who died of a broken heart 6 months later. You destroyed my family. We lost our farm. We lost everything. I scraped myself out of the gutter with one thought to keep me warm at night. The thought of destroying your life just as you destroyed mine. The entire scheme, the land grab, the torment of the town, the bank robbery, it all snapped into focus. It was never about money or power. It was a meticulously crafted stage, and Elias Vance was the lead actor in a tragedy written just for him. So you came after my wife. Elias breathed the words, tasting like ash. Lillian. Silas said, savoring the name. No, I would never have harmed such a lovely creature. Her illness, I'm afraid, was beyond even my influence. But her memory, that was something I could touch. He drew the silver locket from his pocket, letting it swing from its chain. This is just the beginning, Elias. I'm not going to kill you. I'm going to take away everything you care about, one piece at a time. I'm going to make you watch as this town and everyone in it turns to dust. I will leave you with nothing but the memory of what you have lost, just as you left me. He gestured to Sheriff Morrison. Take him. Morrison and the gunmen advanced. But before they could reach Elias, a rifle shot cracked the air. A splinter of wood flew from the saloon sign inches from Morrison's head. On the roof of the general store, Deputy Ben Carter stood with a Winchester rifle, his face pale, but his hands steady. Oh, that's enough, Sheriff. Carter yelled, his voice cracking but firm. This ain't justice, it's just cruelty. On the other side of the street, 2 of Shadow Walker's warriors appeared on a rooftop, their bows drawn. Blackwood's expression didn't change, but a flicker of annoyance crossed his eyes. So the good marshal has found himself some friends. How touching. He turned his back on Elias, a gesture of supreme confidence. This changes nothing. The water remains off. Let's see how long the deputy's courage lasts when the women and children start crying from thirst. He walked away, his men falling in around him. He hadn't won the confrontation, but he had won the day. He had revealed the personal nature of their war, twisting the knife of Elias's past. And he had left Elias with an impossible choice: save himself and his friends, or save the town. As Elias watched him go, he knew that the final battle wouldn't be fought with guns alone. It would be a battle for the soul of Redemption Creek and for his own. The sun was a merciless hammer, and Redemption Creek was its anvil. 2 days without water had transformed the town's simmering fear into raw, desperate panic. The well was a circle of dry mud, and the troughs were bone dry, and the faces of the townspeople were etched with thirst and despair. They looked at Elias, at Ben Carter, at Rebecca, and their gratitude had curdled into resentment. "This is your fault, Doctor," shouted the blacksmith, his face flushed. "You brought this curse down on us." Blackwood didn't need to lift a finger. The town was destroying itself from within. Elias knew he was running out of time. That night, under a sliver of moon, Elias met with Shadow Walker and Ben Carter in the abandoned livery stable. Rebecca was there too, her presence a quiet source of strength. "Blackwood holds all the cards," Ben said, pacing anxiously. "His men have the aqueduct guarded. We can't get close." "Then we do not attack the aqueduct." Shadow Walker said, his voice calm amidst the rising tension. We attack the serpent's head. A direct assault on the ranch is suicide. Elias countered. He'll be expecting it. He expects you to act like a marshal. Shadow Walker replied, his dark eyes meeting Elias's. To challenge him in the street. But you are a healer now. And a healer knows that sometimes to save the body, you must cut out the sickness. He unrolled a crude map drawn on a piece of hide. Blackwood controls the water, but we control the high ground. My warriors can create a diversion at the south end of his ranch. It will draw most of his men. And while they're distracted, Elias asked, you, Carter, and a few of my best men will go in through the north through the old arroyo. It will take you to the back of the main house. You will face Blackwood, and you will end this. It was a desperate, dangerous plan, but it was the only one they had. As they finalized their strategy, Rebecca spoke up. There's something else. The women in town, they're scared, but they're angry too. Mrs. Hartwell, the banker's wife, has been stirring them up, blaming me, blaming the Apache. But some of them remember what Morrison is, what Blackwood is doing to them. She looked at Elias, her eyes clear and determined. They can't fight with guns, but they can fight. The plan was set. The next day, as the sun reached its zenith, the battle for Redemption Creek would begin. The diversion worked perfectly. The sharp crack of rifles echoed from the southern ridges of Blackwood's ranch, and a plume of smoke rose into the air. Elias watched through a pair of field glasses as half of Blackwood's men mounted up and rode hard toward the sound. He, Ben, and 3 Apache warriors, silent as ghosts, made their way up the dry arroyo. The air was still and hot, the silence broken only by the crunch of their boots on the gravel. As they neared the ranch house, Elias felt the old tension, the familiar adrenaline of the hunt. But this time it was different. He wasn't just chasing a criminal, he was confronting his own past. They breached the compound without incident. The remaining guards were distracted, and their attention turned toward the distant fighting. The house was quiet, almost serene. The front door was unlocked. They found Blackwood in his study. He wasn't armed. He was sitting in a high-backed leather chair, a glass of whiskey in one hand, looking out the window. He turned as they entered, his expression not of surprise, but of calm expectation. "I was wondering when you'd arrive, Marshal," he said, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. "Did you enjoy the scenic route?" Elias's pistol was steady in his hand, but he didn't raise it. "It's over, Blackwood. Let the water flow. Let these people go." Blackwood chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Over, my dear Elias, it has barely begun." He gestured to a small, ornate wooden box on his desk. "Before we proceed with the inevitable violence, a piece of history. For you." Warily, Elias approached the desk. He opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a stack of letters tied with a ribbon. The handwriting was his brother's. Daniel was a meticulous record keeper. Blackwood said, his voice soft and venomous. "He wrote to me every week. He told me everything. About his failing farm. About the cruelty of the man who held his mortgage. About how that man had cheated him, had threatened his family. A man who, it turns out, was a silent partner of the El Paso land commissioner." He let the words hang in the air. "My brother wasn't just a drunk waving a gun, Elias. He was a desperate man, cheated and broken, trying to stand up to a corrupt system. And you were that system's instrument. You didn't just kill a man that day. You killed an innocent one." The letters confirmed it. Daniel had been swindled. The eviction notice Elias served had been based on fraud. The man he had killed, the man whose ghost had haunted him for years, had been a victim. The revelation struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. His justified shooting was a lie. His guilt was not just a feeling, it was a fact. This was the moral ambiguity Blackwood had hinted at, the rot at the core of Elias's past. "You see," Blackwood said, rising from his chair, "this was never just about revenge for my brother's death. It's about justice. The justice you denied him. I am simply returning the favor." As Elias reeled from the confession, Blackwood moved. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He pressed a concealed button on the side of his desk. A section of the bookshelf slid open, revealing a hidden passage. "I will not be taken by you, Marshal," Blackwood said, backing into the darkness. "The final act of this play will take place on my stage, in Redemption Creek." The bookshelf slid shut, leaving them in the silent, opulent study. An instant later, the ranch bell began to toll, a frantic clanging alarm. Shouts erupted from outside. The diversion was over. They were trapped. The escape from the ranch was a running gunfight. Blackwood's men, alerted to the trick, converged on the main house. The Apache warriors laid down covering fire, their skill with their rifles buying precious seconds. Ben Carter, his fear replaced by a cold resolve, fought like a veteran. Elias moved through the chaos, his mind a storm. Blackwood's revelation had shaken him to his core, but there was no time for guilt. Survival was all that mattered. They fought their way back to the arroyo, the air thick with gun smoke and the whine of ricochets. One of the warriors fell a silent testament to the cost of their gamble. As they scrambled into the relative safety of the dry riverbed, Elias looked back at the ranch. Blackwood had known they were coming. He had laid a trap not of guns, but of truth, and Elias had walked right into it. They rode back to Redemption Creek under a sky turning a bruised purple. The town was ominously quiet. But as they neared, they saw why. In the center of the main street, a gallows had been erected, a stark, ugly skeleton against the twilight. Sheriff Morrison stood at its base, a smug look on his face. And on the platform, with a noose around her neck, stood Rebecca. The townspeople were gathered, their faces grim. Blackwood stood on the porch of the hotel, a theatrical master of ceremonies. "Welcome back, Marshal," he called out. "You are just in time for the main event. The traitor Rebecca Hayes has been found guilty of conspiring with savages against this community. The sentence is death." He had anticipated every move. He had taken a new hostage, the one person he knew Elias would not abandon. "This is madness," Ben Carter shouted, drawing his pistol. "Is it?" Blackwood replied smoothly. "Or is it law as dictated by Sheriff Morrison?" But then something unexpected happened. A murmur went through the crowd. Mrs. Hartwell, the banker's wife, who had first condemned Rebecca, stepped forward. Her face was pale, but her voice was strong. "This is not law," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "This is murder." Another woman stepped forward, then another. The women of the town, who had been cowed into silence, were finding their voices. They formed a human barrier in front of the gallows, their faces a mixture of fear and defiance. Rebecca's compassion, her quiet strength, had planted a seed, and now it was bearing fruit. A sandstorm was brewing on the horizon. The wind began to pick up, whipping dust through the street, tearing at clothes and stinging the eyes. The sky grew dark, the air thick and electric. It was as if the land itself was rising up in protest. Enough of this," Morrison roared, shoving his way through the women toward the gallows lever. The storm hit. A wall of sand and wind descended on the town, reducing visibility to a few feet. The world became a maelstrom of howling wind and stinging grit. The ticking of the town clock became a frantic, unheard heartbeat in the roar. Chaos erupted. Blackwood's men, blinded by the storm, fired wildly. The Apache warriors, appearing like phantoms from the rooftops, returned fire with deadly accuracy. Ben Carter rallied the few brave men from the town, and a pitched battle began in the heart of the storm. Elias saw his chance. In the swirling dust, he was just another shadow. He moved toward the gallows, his goal, singular Rebecca. Morrison, a lumbering shape in the gale, reached the lever. But before he could pull it, Elias was on him. They crashed to the ground, two ghosts wrestling in a world of sand. Elias's hands found the sheriff's throat. His vow of non-violence was a distant memory burned away by rage and desperation. He felt the life draining from the big man. "Elias, don't." Rebecca's voice cut through his fury. She had managed to work her hands free and was scrambling down from the platform. He looked down at Morrison's terrified, purpling face, and then at Rebecca's pleading eyes. He saw the ghost of Daniel Blackwood and the man he was about to become. He released his grip. He stood up, leaving the gasping sheriff in the dust, and pulled Rebecca into the swirling chaos. He found Blackwood near the town's dry fountain, a pistol in his hand, his elegant clothes now tattered by the wind. He was alone. "It always comes down to this, doesn't it, Marshal?" Blackwood shouted over the wind. "Just two men in the dust." "This isn't about your brother anymore," Elias yelled back. "This is about you, about the poison you've spread. My brother is everything." Blackwood screamed, his cold composure finally cracking. He raised his pistol and fired. The bullet went wide in the gale. Elias charged. He didn't draw his own gun. He tackled Blackwood, and they fell to the ground, rolling in the gritty street. It wasn't a gunfight. It was a brawl fueled by years of pain and hatred. Elias was stronger, but Blackwood was fueled by a fanatic's rage. Blackwood's hand scrabbled in his coat pocket. He pulled out a small derringer. As he tried to bring it to bear, Elias slammed his wrist against the stone edge of the fountain. The gun clattered away. A small folded piece of paper fell from Blackwood's pocket. Elias landed a solid punch, dazing his opponent. As Blackwood struggled to rise, Elias snatched the paper. He glanced at it, the words illuminated by a flash of lightning. It was another letter from Daniel. But this one was different. "Brother, the man who cheated me, the one I told you about. It's your partner from the freight business. He betrayed us both. He is the one who has ruined us. I am going to confront him. I don't care what the marshal says." The truth hit Elias with the force of the wind. Silas had known. He had known his brother was going to confront a different man. He had known Daniel wasn't a victim of the system, but of his own partner. And Silas had known his own partner had betrayed him. "You knew." Elias whispered, the realization dawning. "You knew your brother wasn't innocent." Blackwood looked up, his face a mask of hate and despair. "He was my brother, my blood, that marshal, that man you were. You were an easy target for my hate. Better to blame a faceless lawman than to admit my own partner, my own life's work was built on a lie. My revenge, it wasn't for him. It was for me. His entire crusade, the lives he had ruined, the pain he had caused, it was all built on a tragic, selfish lie. He was avenging a man who didn't deserve it to avoid facing his own failures." In that moment, Elias's rage vanished, replaced by a profound, aching pity. Ben Carter appeared out of the storm, his rifle aimed at Blackwood. "It's over." Blackwood simply slumped to the ground, defeated not by a bullet, but by the weight of his own bitter truth. The fight was gone from his eyes, leaving only a hollow emptiness. The sandstorm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world scoured clean. The wind died down, and a fragile dawn broke over Redemption Creek. The sky was a pale, tender blue, and the air smelled of rain and wet earth. In the night, the storm had brought a deluge. The aqueduct, cracked and broken, had overflowed, and water now trickled through the town's dusty streets. The battle was over. Blackwood's remaining gunmen had surrendered. Silas Blackwood himself sat in a cell in the sheriff's office, a silent, broken man, stripped of his power and his purpose. Deputy Ben Carter, his badge now polished, stood guard. He was the law now. The townspeople emerged from their homes, blinking in the new light. They looked at the splintered gallows, at the bodies of the fallen, and at each other. There was shame in their eyes, but there was also a glimmer of something new resolve. They began the slow, arduous work of cleaning up, of rebuilding not just their town, but their community. Elias moved among them, his medicine bag in hand. He was no longer just a doctor. He was their healer. He tended to the wounded from both sides, his hands gentle and sure. He worked alongside Rebecca, their silence filled with a shared understanding. They had faced the darkness together and had come out the other side. Later that day, he stood with Shadow Walker on a ridge overlooking the town. The Apache elder had a small, satisfied smile on his face. "The water has returned," he said. "The sickness has been cut out. Many were hurt." Elias said, his voice heavy, "Our wounds heal." Shadow Walker replied, placing a hand on Elias's shoulder. "Scars remind us of the price of peace. You have found your path, healer. It was not the one you sought, but it is the one that was meant for you." Their conversation was quiet, an acknowledgement of a journey shared through pain and toward a fragile peace. The relationship between the town and the Apache, born of violence and suspicion, had begun its own slow process of healing. Months passed. Redemption Creek began to live up to its name. Under Ben Carter's fair-minded leadership and with the quiet guidance of Elias and Rebecca, the town thrived. A new treaty was drawn up with Shadow Walker's people, one based on mutual respect and shared resources. The fences came down. On a warm autumn afternoon, Elias rode out to the small windswept hill where he had buried Lillian years ago, a place he hadn't had the strength to visit until now. The wooden cross was weathered but strong. He knelt, the silence of the prairie wrapping around him like a blanket. From his pocket, he took the silver locket recovered from Blackwood's desk. He polished it with his sleeve until it shone the silver warm from the sun. He opened it one last time, looking at Lillian's smiling face. For so long, her memory had been a source of pain, a symbol of his failure and his violent past. He had clung to it, a drowning man, clinging to a piece of wreckage. Now he saw not loss but love, not an end but a beginning. With a gentle reverence, he placed the locket on the earth at the base of the headstone. He was not abandoning her memory. He was setting it and himself free. He was no longer Marshall Vance, the man of vengeance, nor was he the haunted drifter running from his ghosts. He was Elias, the healer of Redemption Creek. He had found his peace, not by forgetting his past, but by finally making amends for it. He stood, turned his back to the grave, and walked toward the town where his future and a new life awaited.